Daf Yomi, Tractate Bava Metzia, page 31a, at top of the page, with the words Be'is Ratia Upara Rasa Bein HaKramim. On a main thoroughfare, Istratia, or a cow running through the vineyards, that is lost property. If one found a cloak alongside a fence, an axe alongside a fence, or a cow grazing among the vineyards, that is not lost property. If one sees these items for 3 consecutive days, that is lost property. If one saw water that is flowing and coming to inundate another's field, he must establish a barrier before the water in order to preserve the field. It's kind of hard to understand, because if water is flowing enough to inundate a field, can you imagine how much water that is? It would be hard for a person to establish a barrier before the water. And if it's a small amount of water, then it's not going to harm the field. It's hard to visualize a situation where that would be relevant. But anyway, Bava says that the verse, "And so you shall do with every lost item of your brother," Deuteronomy 22 verse 3, serves to include an obligation to protect your brother from the loss of his land. Rav Chananya said to Rava, "There is a braita that is taught that supports your opinion. If one saw water that is flowing and coming to inundate another's field, he must establish a barrier before the water to preserve the field." Rava said to Rav Chananya, "If you are attempting to bring support for my ruling due to that braita, do not support my ruling. With what are we dealing here in the braita? We are dealing with a field in which there are sheaves of grain on the land. The Tana of the braita is referring to preservation of the sheaves, not the land itself. The Gemara asks, if the braita is referring to field in which there are sheaves of grain, what is the purpose of stating it? Isn't it obvious that one is obligated to preserve the sheaves as he would any other item?" Yeah, the verse was Ra Mayim Shishotfim Ubayin. Right? It's gonna inundate someone's field. Anyway, isn't it obvious that one is obligated to preserve the sheaves as he would any other? No, it is necessary to state the halacha only in a case where there are sheaves that need the land in order to dry. Lest you say, since they still need the land, their legal status is like that of the land itself, and he is not obligated to return them. The braita teaches us that the sheaves are independent of the land and must be preserved. Okay? The Mishnah teaches if one found a donkey or a cow grazing on the path, that is not deemed lost property. The Gemara asks, this itself is difficult. On the one hand, you said, if one found a donkey or a cow grazing on the path, that is not lost property, from which it may be inferred that only if it is grazing on the path, it is not lost property, but if it was running on the path or grazing among the vineyards, it is a lost item. On the other hand, say the latter clause of the Mishnah, if one found a donkey with its accoutrements overturned or a cow that ran through the vineyards. A cow running through a vineyard? Was there ever a cow that ever ran through a vineyard in the history of mankind? A cow running through a vineyard. Can you imagine that? Anyway, that is lost property. It's lost intellectual property. From this wording, it may be inferred that only if the animal is running through the vineyards is lost property. But if it's running on the path or grazing among the vineyards, it is not lost property. How did a cow get to a vineyard? Just think about the nonsensical nature of this thing. Abaye said that the Tana employs the style of its counterpart tells about it. See Job 36:33. And the Mishnah distinguishes between grazing and running. The Tana taught a case of grazing on the path, where the animal is not considered lost property, and the same is true of a case where the animal is grazing among the vineyards, and the Tana taught a case of running through the vineyards, where the animal is considered lost property, and the same is true of a case where the animal is running on the path. Rava said to him, if the Tana employs the style of its counterpart tells about it, let him teach the lenient case, and all the more so it would apply to the stringent case. The Gemara elaborates, let the Tana teach that when the animal is running on the path, it is lost property, and all the more so it is lost property when it is running through the vineyards. And let the Tana teach that when the animal is grazing among the vineyards, it is not lost property, and all the more so, it is not lost property when it is grazing on the path. Rather, Rava said the apparent contradiction between the inference from the first clause with regard to running on the path, and the inference from the latter clause with regard to running on the path is not difficult. This inference from the first clause that an animal running on the path is lost property is referring to a case where its face is directed toward the field and is running away from the city. That inference from the latter clause that an animal running on the path is not lost property is referring to a case where its face is directed toward the city. Rava continues, the apparent contradiction between the inference from the first clause with regard to grazing among the vineyards and the inference from the latter clause with regard to grazing among the vineyards is also not difficult. Here, the inference from the latter clause that an animal grazing among the vineyards is not lost property is with regard to loss of the animal itself. There, the inference from the first clause that the halachot of lost property apply in the case of an animal grazing among the vineyards is referring to loss in the sense of damage to the land. Let's see where we're holding here. Damage to the land. The Gemara elaborates when the Tana teaches that in the case of an animal grazing on the path, the halachot of lost property do not apply, from which it is inferred, but in the case of an animal grazing among the vineyards, the halachot of lost property do apply. It is referring to preventing loss in the sense of damage due to the land caused by the animal. And when the Tana teaches that in the case of an animal running among the vineyards, the halachot of lost property do apply, from which it is inferred, but in the case of an animal grazing among the vineyards, the halachot of lost property do not apply, is referring to loss of the animal itself, as an animal running through the vineyards is typically wounded with lacerations from the vines, but an animal grazing among the vineyards is not typically wounded. The Gemara asks, with regard to the inference from the latter clause, that in the case of an animal grazing among the vineyards, the halachot of lost property do not apply, although it is not wounded, why not derive the halachot of lost property do apply due to loss in the sense of damage to the land caused by the animal? The Gemara answers, it is stated with regard to the land of a Gentile, which one is not obligated to return or preserve. I'm just reading it. I'm not saying whether, whatever. The Gemara questions this explanation, but why not derive that one is obligated to return it due to loss of the animal itself, as perhaps the Gentiles will kill it? The Gemara answers, it is stated with regard to a place where they forewarn the owner and only then kill the animal. The Gemara challenges, and perhaps they already forewarned the owner with regard to the animal. The Gemara explains, if they already forewarned the owner with regard to the animal, and the owner did not heed the warning, this is certainly a case of deliberate loss where there is no obligation to return it. And we'll continue with part B.